Maggie turned a corner and stopped short. The corridor split in two. The passages were identical. The wet stone walls and the muddy floors were exactly the same. They both ran straight for a bit and turned at the same place. One went to the left, and the other to the right. Maggie had no idea which one to choose. As she stood pondering her situation, there was a distant sound, a low thud, a scraping noise. Thor. Maggie picked the closest tunnel and sprinted down it. She turned left and plunged into the dark corridor. The light was low and her eyes did not adjust immediately. She stumbled blindly down the hall. The air was dank and heavy. A putrid cloud hung over her. Then there was a shuffling sound in the dark in front of her. Maggie stopped. There was the clink of chains and more shuffling. A thin, pale arm appeared out of the shadows. The hand clawed at the air in front of Maggie, and a dry, husky voice whispered from the darkness. "Thor, is that you?" Maggie swallowed. Her throat was suddenly impossibly dry. "No, It's not Thor." There was a long silence, then more shuffling. "Did he catch you too?" "Who? Thor? Did he do this to you?" "No, not Thor." The voice cracked and broke into a wet, barking cough. Maggie waited impatiently for it to end. It had to be Thor. Who else was there? The coughing stopped. Maggie sighed loudly. "Who are you?" "I'm Thor's best client." Maggie didn't know what to say. There was more shuffling in the shadows. A thin, gray leg appeared, followed by what was left of a face. The eyes were sunk deep in their sockets. Gray, papery skin hung in loose folds from the high cheekbones. The body was shrunken and concave. A skeleton with skin. "Look how thin I am. It's all thanks to Thor. Have you seen him? He used to visit me, but he hasn't in a long time." She tried to smile. The skin cracked and flaked away. Her mouth was a gaping hole. She had no teeth. "Get away from this hideous thing. She's dead already. Thor's coming. You need to run." Maggie backed away. The remains of Thor's best client shuffled back into the shadows. "Run!" Maggie fled. She flew down the corridor. Her legs were weary, but she pushed on. She rounded the corner and saw the steely light of morning. Fresh air. She ran faster. When she reached the opening, Maggie paused and stepped cautiously out into the forest. She could see the wall. It was a remote section hidden from the guard towers by a tangle of fallen trees. She was so close to freedom. Heavy footfalls crashed through the fallen leaves and forest debris. Maggie dove into the brush. A sharp branch pierced her skin and left a line of blood down her leg. The footsteps were getting louder. A monstrous man stepped out from behind a tree. He strode through the trees and past Maggie without noticing her. He was close enough for her to smell his cologne. He was dressed in camouflage, but moved without concern. This was his routine, and he was being careless. He didn't expect to find anyone out among the trees. She waited for him to disappear and darted away in the opposite direction. She kept close to the edge of the forest and followed the wall. Not far from the exit of Thor's dungeon was another guard tower. Maggie ducked behind a tree and peered cautiously around the trunk. After a moment, she spotted a man in the tower. He paced the perimeter of his perch with a gun held loosely in his hands. Maggie took a deep breath and moved quickly from tree to tree. She watched the guard tower closely and ducked behind the trees whenever the man appeared. He was moving at a slow, leisurely pace, and his appearances came at steady intervals. Okay, he's out of sight. Run faster. Somehow Maggie managed to keep going. Her legs were on fire and threatening to collapse underneath her. She stumbled through some thick brush. The brambles caught in her hair and scratched her face. A thin trickle of blood ran down her chin. She wiped it away with the back of her hand. She burst through a tangle of vines and found herself at the road that would take her back to Famecili. Maggie crawled up the embankment and hesitated. What now? Maggie didn't know what to do. Could she go back and pretend that nothing had happened? Surely someone had seen her unexpected detour. There were cameras all over the city. Did they go all the way out to the wall? Of course they do, you idiot. No point in thinking about it. The only option right now is to go back and see what's waiting for us. We're not getting through the wall today. Thor knew, but she didn't think he would say anything. The SuperGym's #1 trainer could never admit that his client had disobeyed him and broken curfew, as well as countless other laws. Mr. Pratt would be furious. Thor might end up in more trouble than she was. Maggie slumped down onto a rotten log. The wood was soft under her fingers. It felt alive with the vibrations of the insects working busily beneath the surface. She had to go back. Other Maggie was right. There was no other choice. She had gone as far as she could, but there was no way over the wall. Maggie dug her nails into the log. 2 fat tears slid down her cheeks and dripped onto her legs. She didn't want to go back. You need to deal with Dr. Clyde. He's the next step. Dr. Clyde wasn't as physically intimidating as Thor, but he was unpredictable. His bland kindness and emotionless expression were a mask. She didn't know what he was hiding, but Maggie was pretty sure she didn't want to see what was underneath. All of Mr. Pratt's top people enjoyed their jobs, but Dr. Clyde seemed to like his most of all. The others had weaknesses. Even Thor had a vulnerable side. He exploded into rages. He was emotional. Dr. Clyde looked at her with clinical interest. There was no trace of feeling behind those shiny, round glasses. It was impossible to know what he was thinking, and that scared her. Maggie cast one last look at the door that led to the other side of the wall. She was so close to freedom, so close to escaping Benjamin Pratt and his SuperGyms. Maggie shook her head. She couldn't go back. She had to find a way to get to the other side of the wall. Thor was coming. Maggie could hear his steady footfalls. They were getting closer. She turned toward the sound and saw his huge frame barreling down on her at full speed. His face was a purple mask of rage. He was beside her in an instant, and his hand clamped down on her arm so hard it felt as if it would snap in two. Ow, you're hurting me. Shut up. What do you think you're doing out here? You can't be here. If they find you, we'll both be killed. He grabbed her by the shoulders and shook her hard. Her teeth rattled. The image of the ghastly wreck hidden in the secret corridor appeared before her. You're not going back there. Fight if you need to. Maggie was holding her breath. Lights danced in front of her eyes, and she quickly exhaled a long, defeated sigh. The anger left Thor's face. His perfect posture threatened to cave as his shoulders slumped forward just a little. He pulled her close and wrapped his arms around her. One hand held her head to his chest, and he buried his face in her hair. He inhaled deeply and sighed with pleasure. I want to help you, Maggie. I really do. But this is a game. You have to have a strategy. I can help you, but you'll have to trust me and do everything I say. She didn't trust him. Maggie wasn't buying into this new version of Thor. He was the same heartless training monster she had always known. Once again, the remains of the woman floated through her mind. Still, something made her hesitate. His face had changed. It was very subtle, but it was there. Something in his eyes. Concern. Of course he's concerned. He's worried he'll get caught. Maggie wasn't listening. She moved closer. Her body brushed against his, and her heart raced. What are you doing? Not now. His hand went to her hip, and he pulled her against him. I guess we can use this, somehow. Play along. Maggie didn't see any other choice. She lightly touched his chest. She tried to make her eyes round and innocent as she gazed up at him. Not so tight. You're hurting me. His grip loosened, but he didn't let go. Maggie leaned her head against his chest. His heart was racing. He lowered his head over her for just a moment. His breath was hot against her cheek. Then he pulled away suddenly. Maggie stumbled and fell into him, and he pushed her away. His face was flushed. His eyes darted around wildly. Beads of sweat were forming on his heavy brow. Thor ran a hand over his face, shook his head violently, and bounced up and down on the balls of his feet a few times. We have to go. Now. We have to get back to the gym before they notice we're gone. I'll say you did an early morning boot camp in the park. That will explain your clothes. Maggie looked down. Her clothes were streaked with reddish-brown smudges. She hadn't noticed them before. Her arms were black with dried slime. Thor was agitated. He shifted from one foot to the other. He clapped his hands together, and Maggie jumped. The sound was sharp in the quiet morning. Get moving. Hustle, hustle, hustle. He slapped her ass. It stung. Maggie gave a yelp of surprise and sprinted away down the road. Thor stayed on her heels the whole time. She turned once to look at him over her shoulder. His face was grim. He didn't speak but stayed just behind her and pushed her to go faster and faster. They were soon back in the city. As the bleak gray skyline opened up before her, Maggie thought again of the rolling hills and bright flowers, of the wall and Trent. How could she have lived her entire life in Famecili and never once thought to look beyond the borders? They reached the SuperGym an hour later. The rooms were already filled with clients plodding away on treadmills as their trainers paced the aisles and adjusted the machines. Maggie's head ached, and the sound of pounding feet caused bright spots of light to bloom in front of her eyes. She was drenched in sweat, and every muscle was cramping. The darkness around the periphery of her vision pulsed. Maggie knew she was close to passing out. Thor, however, looked refreshed and revitalized, much happier than before. That was a good warm-up, he said as he cracked the knuckles of his massive hands. He grinned at her with his brilliant white smile. Now get inside, and let's get to the real work. Maggie hated him so much. Chapter 12. The run helped a little, but it wasn't enough. Thor still didn't feel right. He watched Maggie stagger inside and drop onto a pile of mats. Her skin glistened with sweat. Her face was pale. Bright red spots bloomed on her cheeks. She looked beautiful. Thor shook his head violently. No more thinking. He was a man of action, not thoughts. Thinking was never helpful. Maggie was nothing more than a disobedient client. Her workout was brutal. Thor brought out Helen, a 25-pound ball. The brown leather was faded and cracked. Dark smudges of old blood stained the surface. All of Thor's past clients feared Helen. He only brought it out for special occasions. Maggie groaned at the sight of the heavy ball. After the run, she had endured hours of burpees and box jumps. There was no part of her body that didn't hurt. Thor grinned. His bright smile made his face even more handsome, and Maggie felt her stomach turn over. It was never good to see Thor smile. Remember Helen? Maggie glared at him. He threw the ball at her feet. Pick it up. Hold it over your head. Lunges. Down the hall and back. Move it. How many times? I'll tell you when to stop. He said it with a forced laugh, but inside he felt terrible. Maggie's expression made him hurt deep in the center of his chest, and he didn't like it. Feelings were for the weak. He wasn't weak. There was only one way to deal with feelings: exercise. Since he couldn't do his own workout, he had to take it out on her. Maggie was crying. He didn't like it, but he had no choice. He had to hurt her. Mr. Pratt insisted. The man was obsessed with Maggie. He had even dated her mother to get closer to her. She'd only been a child then. Not that age mattered to Benjamin Pratt. His obsession knew no bounds. Thor was devoted to Mr. Pratt and had sworn an oath to serve him for the rest of his life. The food labs were constantly putting out new products, and with the dietitian's new discoveries, Mr. Pratt could live for a very long time. Thor had never considered the ramifications of his promise before. There hadn't been a reason. Until Tessa's death and his assignment to Maggie's case, Thor had been perfectly satisfied with his life. Maggie had reached the end of the hallway again. Her arms were shaking, and Helen was so low it was almost resting on her head. Thor blew a sharp blast on his whistle. "Enough. Get over here." She dropped Helen and slowly shuffled down the hall. The look of hatred on her face made him feel sick, but he tried to smile. "What's wrong, princess? Tired?" Another dark look. He would have given anything to take that look away. Her legs gave out then, and she fell to her knees. A small cry escaped her lips. The pain in Thor's chest was getting worse. He scooped her up in his arms and carried her to the recovery room. The row of bubbling tubs stood empty. He placed her carefully on the edge of the nearest tub and began to undress her. Maggie was too exhausted to care. Thor's heart raced as his hands made contact with her skin. He finished undressing her quickly, helped her into the tub, and ran from the room. He sprinted down the hall and into his office. He shut the door and locked it. No one had seen him. He was almost sure of it. Of course, he couldn't be certain. His tight little running shorts made his situation obvious, and he had passed several clients in the hall. He just had to hope they were in too much agony to notice. He sat at his desk and tried to take a few deep breaths. Slowly, his heart rate lowered. He felt calmer. This couldn't keep happening. Someone was sure to find out. If Mr. Pratt knew, it would be the end of both of them. Fat camp would be the only suitable punishment. Thor couldn't be demoted. He'd worked too hard to become Mr. Pratt's #1 trainer. He'd done too many unspeakable things. Had so many sleepless nights. He had to get over Maggie. Once he had calmed down, he returned to the jacuzzi room. Maggie was still ensconced in bubbles, and she was asleep. Her face was slack and not pretty. Her hair was a sweaty, tangled mess, and a bubble of spit glistened at the corner of her mouth. Thor didn't find her attractive. It was a relief. His crush had been brief, a moment of madness. Now it was over, and life could return to normal. Then she opened her big blue eyes, and his heart exploded. It all came rushing back. She sighed and glared at him. Thor smiled. "Feeling better?" "Why? Do you have another round of torture planned for me?" He held out his hand to her. "Not today. Let your muscles rest." She looked at him with distrust. "Really?" "Sure." "Error. What's wrong with him?" She hesitantly reached out and took his hand. She slipped as he pulled her up, and she fell against him. Instinctively, he wrapped his arms around her. His clothes were soaked, but he held her close. His heart was pounding. There was no way she couldn't hear it. She looked up at him, and he kissed her. He hadn't meant to do it. It was dangerous. Anyone could walk in and catch them. He began to pull away, but she was kissing him back, and it was too nice. He pulled her closer. He didn't want to ever let her go. Maggie put her hands on his chest and pushed back a little. "What are you doing?" He didn't know what to say. There were tears in her eyes. She made a small sound and shook her head. "Fine, I don't care. Let's get it over with." Thor's grip relaxed and she slipped out of his arms. She went to a nearby bench and lay down. Thor could feel the heat stirring inside him and quickly crossed his arms over his chest. "That's not what I want. Cover yourself." He threw a towel at her. He hated the way his voice cracked as he spoke. Maggie eyed him suspiciously as she picked up the towel and wrapped it around her body. "Why did you kiss me? What do you want?" Thor took a step closer. Her grip on the towel tightened. "I don't know. I wanted to. Was it that bad?" "No. It was kind of nice." She almost looked like she was going to smile, but she didn't. "But you're not nice." There was a dull, heavy pain in his chest. He couldn't breathe. Was he having a heart attack? Thor didn't know. He'd never paid attention in biology. It hadn't seemed important. Heart attack or not, he knew one thing. At that moment, he wanted to die. "I can't be nice." She laughed. The sound pierced him. He was filled with a painful, burning sensation between his ribs. Then the door opened. Scott and one of his clients walked in. The client was sweaty, but he didn't look very tired. Scott was a lenient trainer, and Thor had disciplined him many times before. He straightened up and set his face in an intimidating scowl. "Done already, Scott?" The man seemed to shrink before him. Scott quickly pulled out his tablet and stared at it intently. "No, of course not. Come on, Jim. Back to the pool." The client's shoulders slumped forward. Scott practically shoved him through the door. "The pool?" Thor shook his head. It was no surprise that Scott was at the bottom of the trainer list. He'd be a fat camp counselor soon if he didn't start pushing his clients harder. Thor turned his attention back to Maggie. She moved quickly across the room, opened a storage closet, and removed a new set of clothes. She dressed quickly behind the partially open door. Thor couldn't see anything. It seemed pointless. He had already seen everything she had to offer, but he waited patiently for her to finish. When she came out in a new set of sweats, he smiled. Maggie still looked suspicious. They stared at each other for a moment. Thor wasn't sure what to say. Suddenly, the door flew open and Benjamin Pratt strode in. Thor jumped to attention. Maggie took a step back into the closet and gave Thor a pleading, wide-eyed look, as if he could do anything to save her. Mr. Pratt was grinning. His bright white teeth shone in contrast with his bronze skin, but there was nothing behind the smile. His eyes were cold and glittered with malice. Thor's muscles had failed him completely. He couldn't move. Did Mr. Pratt know? Had he installed cameras in the jacuzzi room? There had never been cameras in there before. The room provided comfort and was so seldom used that it had never been a priority for security monitoring. Mr. Pratt walked up to Thor and slapped him on the back. "How's my most difficult client? Going easy on her today, my boy?" Thor couldn't speak. His jaw locked and the words wouldn't come. He avoided looking at Mr. Pratt directly. Maggie moved deeper into the closet. She was mostly hidden by the door, as if that could stop him. As if anything could. "I need a moment alone with Maggie." Thor knew the look. He didn't move. "Thor." There was an edge to Mr. Pratt's voice. "Get out, my boy." What else could he do? He had sworn an oath to this man. Mr. Pratt had saved his life, and his obedience was a pathetic exchange for the charmed life of a trainer. He moved toward the door. His eyes carefully avoided the closet. She would hate him even more now. The door clicked shut behind him, and he waited. Every room in the SuperGym was soundproof. Mr. Pratt had requested it when the buildings were first renovated, and they'd done a good job. Thor couldn't hear anything. The only sounds were the distant shouts from Cardio Room B and the ever-present drone of treadmills. Thor knew he should walk away. He could go do a nice hard workout in the weight room while he waited. Straining under some steel would distract him from his imagination, which was currently running wild. But his feet wouldn't move. They were rooted to the thin gray carpet. His hand strayed to the doorknob for a moment, but he snatched it back. He knew better than to interrupt Mr. Pratt. After about 20 minutes, the door opened. Mr. Pratt emerged. His clothes and hair were their usual perfection. His smile was wide and white. He laughed when he saw Thor standing by the door. "Might want to give her a minute to clean up, my boy." He slapped Thor on the back and laughed. "By the way, I've put her on a new plan. The dietitians will be here soon." Thor's heart sank. The dietitians. But they don't know anything. "What's wrong with you today, my boy? Is Maggie giving you a hard time? I've never known a client to get the best of you." Thor straightened up. "Of course not. I can handle her." "That's my boy. I knew you could manage her. She already looks a little thinner. Good work." Another slap on the back and he was gone. Thor's shoulders slumped. He pushed open the door with an unfamiliar heaviness in his chest. Maggie was sitting on the edge of the tub. Her arms were wrapped tightly around her body, and she was shaking. She didn't look up when he entered. Thor didn't know what to do. He stood in the doorway and watched her for a long time. Finally, he placed his hand on her shoulder. She lifted her face, and he saw the tears streaming down her cheeks. He saw the fury in her eyes. He had expected sadness, but her face was full of hate. "What do you want? Why can't you just leave me alone?" Another sob racked her body. Thor pulled his hand away. "I'm sorry." He'd never said those words before. They seemed to come from someone else. Still, it was the truth. He was truly sorry for what he had done, and for what he knew was coming. Chapter 13. The dietitians came for her a few hours later. Maggie had just finished a second grueling workout. Thor had been relentless. Whatever had happened before, Mr. Pratt's visit had snapped him back to his normal self. He took his anger out on her in the form of burpees, squats, and bear crawls. There had been a brief moment of hope before Mr. Pratt showed up, but it was destroyed in an instant. Her insides hurt as much as her muscles, and the workout made it worse. She wanted to die. Benjamin Pratt watched her every move. Maggie could feel his eyes boring into her. She worked harder than she ever had before. She had to show him that she would not be broken. He couldn't win against her determination. Yes, he can. He's the big boss. She ignored other Maggie. She didn't have time for that kind of negativity. A plan was forming. She would escape. The wall was calling to her, and it was all she could think about. She would find out what was on the other side. Freedom. She focused on the thought. It got her through every task Thor laid before her. She knew when Benjamin Pratt left, her soul felt lighter, and she knew that in some small way she was triumphant. Her triumph was short-lived. The dietitians were all thin, pale, and sickly. They wore white lab coats and thick glasses and carried tablets. They were less threatening, but they had the same air of importance that the trainers possessed. Everyone noticed when they entered a room. Except for the sound of feet pounding on the treadmills, the cardio room was silent. All eyes were on the 3 white coats. Even Thor stopped berating her and watched them approach. His face was a mask. They surveyed the clients as they passed and stopped in front of Maggie, who was lying in a puddle of sweat on the floor and gasping for air. The tallest one, a woman with frizzy brown hair, looked down at her tablet. "Client 54467, Maggie Ashwood?" Maggie's throat felt like sandpaper. "Yes?" "Come with us, please." They turned abruptly and left without another look at her. She climbed shakily to her feet and looked at Thor. His brow was furrowed, and he looked concerned. "You'd better go with them. Hustle." There was a knot in the pit of her stomach. She was shocked to find that she feared these 3 white coats more than Thor. Staying with him suddenly seemed like a better option. They had already reached the lobby. Thor gave her a little push. Go, Maggie. You don't have a choice. She could feel everyone's eyes on her as she trudged through the gym on spent, wobbling legs. The dietitians were waiting for her outside. A long white car pulled up in front. Cars were not completely outlawed, but Maggie had never seen one before. Only the highest-ranked members of the Council of Health were allowed to ride in cars, and they rarely visited the SuperGyms. The door of the car opened, and the 3 whitecoats climbed in. They seemed excited about riding in the luxurious machine. The tall woman beckoned to her. Get in. The car was spacious with soft, comfortable seats. The dietitians chatted amongst themselves and lounged. Maggie was temporarily forgotten. She stared out the window. The buildings were a gray blur as they sped by. The car was fast, and she felt sick with the motion. They took a twisting route through the city that ended up at the industrial complex. There was a tall wire fence around the buildings. Smoke billowed out of the big silver pipes that stuck up into the sky. It was darker here. The clouds were thicker. The world was shrouded in gloom. The car pulled up in front of a plain white brick building, and the dietitians pushed her out. They led her into the building and up endless flights of stairs. The walls were cement and painted white. A thick layer of grime covered everything. The stairs were gray and worn. Each step was a little too tall, and it was an effort to hoist her body eternally upward. Her legs went numb. She stumbled on the next step and smashed her knee into the concrete. White-hot pain shot through her. That was okay. Pain was okay. As long as she could feel something, she didn't have to think. I wonder what's at the top. No, I won't think about it. You'll be too tired to fight. She couldn't worry about that. One step. Foot up. Push. Lift your giant body up. Step. Push. Lift. It hurt. The numbness was gone. It was replaced by a burning pain deep in her muscles. That was good. She let her mind revel in it. There was nothing else. Just the endless stairs and the sweet, sweet pain. They finally reached the top. Maggie wasn't the only one hurting from the trip. The dietitians were red-faced and panting. They had to stop and rest with their hands on their knees. The tall woman coughed until her body was racked with convulsions. They were thin but not healthy. Not the ideal. A steel door was all that awaited them at the top of the stairs. A small sign marked it as the office of the chief dietitian. Maggie swallowed nervously. The other dietitians looked nervous as well. The tall woman knocked on the door 3 times, and they could hear the sound of a large lock being turned. The 3 whitecoats backed away quickly. They were several flights down as the door started to open. Maggie was left alone. The door stood open, but Maggie didn't move. Everything in the room beyond was bright, white, and sterile. That's not good. No, it's definitely not good. Client 54467. You may enter. The voice was familiar. She moved slowly to the door and peered inside. Come in. Dr. Clyde looked different in this setting. He was seated behind a large steel table. His glasses reflected the harsh white lights and hid his eyes. He adjusted them and motioned for her to sit on the examining table. He consulted his tablet for a long moment. The room was quiet except for the hum of machinery. Blinking lights and screens covered one wall. Each screen showed a blue line. Most of them rose and fell steadily. Occasionally, a line would go straight, and the screen would go blank. Dr. Clyde stood up suddenly. Maggie, he sighed and adjusted his glasses again. I'm very disappointed in your progress. I'm sorry about last night. I passed out on my bike and somehow I ended up... He waved his hand impatiently. Yes, I've been briefed on your every movement since our last meeting. I know all about last night. Not a good way to begin. Not at all. We had such high hopes for you. Tessa would be so disappointed. If she was still alive. Another line went straight, and the screen blinked off. I said I was sorry. Of course you're sorry. Now you'll need to prove it. Your actions will show the truth, not your words. You have an opportunity, Maggie. Another chance. You can become a better person if you choose to do so. You could even be one of our elite. You have it in you. What are you talking about? Mr. Pratt wants you to become a trainer. Level up. You have something special inside you, Maggie. I'd like to help you discover it. If you'll let me. I don't think... Dr. Clyde laughed. It was a bitter laugh without any mirth. The sound was mechanical and cold. I am sorry, but you don't have a choice. Well, that's not entirely true. You have one choice. You can follow the plan and become what Mr. Pratt wants you to become. Or you can go to Fat Camp. Fat Camp. The 24-hour gym. Campers exercise day and night with small breaks for meals and sleep. Some said it was better than regular existence. Others claimed it was torture. No one knew if it actually existed. The final level. Maggie turned away from Dr. Clyde's blank stare. Another screen went blank. She took a deep breath. How do I become a trainer? Dr. Clyde smiled. Excellent choice. He consulted his tablet. First things first, I'm afraid you must be punished. I am sorry about this. If you had just followed the rules, it would not be necessary. But you have made your choice. He went to the wall opposite the screens and touched a panel. It slid open, and he removed a long silver coil. He unrolled the small hose. The examining table came to life, and Maggie was thrust back against the seat. Metal straps held her in place. Dr. Clyde approached her with a small, sympathetic smile on his boyish face. I am sorry about this. He placed the hose in her mouth and began shoving it down her throat. She gagged and tried to vomit. Dr. Clyde made a small noise in the back of his throat and shook his head. Not yet. She could feel the hose inside her. It was cold and reached down into her stomach. Dr. Clyde stepped back with a satisfied smile and nodded once more before consulting his tablet. He went to the wall and tapped on a screen. Numbers flashed across it. He set the display to 5. A low chugging noise came from the wall, and the hose began to rattle against her teeth. Something was filling her stomach. She felt her stomach lining stretch to its limit. Dr. Clyde was slowly removing the hose as it continued to fill her. Her insides burned, and treacherous tears spilled down her cheeks. He looked at her with his bland sympathy. A detox. You are not losing weight. I'm afraid that is unacceptable. You are Tessa's legacy, and I will not allow you to destroy her memory. She knew you were a lost cause, but she refused to give up. If only you had that kind of tenacity, maybe you would be a little less disgusting. He grinned and removed the hose. Green sludge dripped from the end, and Maggie felt an urgent need to vomit. There. Now comes the fun part. Nothing better than a good cleanse. He handed her a bucket and walked out of the room without another word. She was violently sick. It came in waves. Her body convulsed against the straps as she struggled to reach the bucket. She was covered in green slime. It stunk, and the smell set off another painful wave of vomiting. The bucket was useless. It would never end. She was certain she would die. There was nothing left in her, but she couldn't stop. Her body contorted and convulsed. The metal straps dug into her flesh. Thin rivulets of blood streaked her arms and mixed with the foul mess. She heaved and cried and begged for it to end. Then she threw up blood, and everything went black. Chapter 14. Thor waited outside Benjamin Pratt's office near the window and looked out over Famecili. The SuperGym headquarters was located in the center of the city. The building towered over everything else. A large sign on the roof bathed the surrounding buildings in a purple light. Andy, Mr. Pratt's secretary, watched him from her wide glass desk. A large framed portrait of Benjamin Pratt hung behind her. The photographer had lit him from behind, using bright purples and greens. The whites of his eyes shone out of the picture and seemed to follow a person around the room. Thor could feel both sets of eyes watching him. Andy watched every person that came into the office. She was ferociously loyal to Benjamin Pratt and his plan. If she thought anything was amiss, she would not hesitate to tell him her suspicions. Thor was careful to keep his face neutral and his body controlled. Andy had openly admitted her interest in Thor, but he knew better than to trust her. This was the first time he'd been called to the headquarters without knowing why. He was nervous. He hated the feeling. A cloud of doom surrounded him. After the disaster with Maggie, he was certain he would soon be demoted. Andy's shrill voice sliced through his thoughts. "Mr. Pratt will see you now." She didn't buzz open the door. Thor looked at her and raised an eyebrow. Andy leaned over the desk. Her nearly non-existent breasts were visible through her sheer blouse. She pursed her painted lips in a little pout. "Nice to see you again, Thor. I thought you were going to call." Thor ignored her. He had made a mistake. A huge mistake. At the time he had just finished an extra 20-mile run. His blood sugar was low. He hadn't considered the consequences. He'd been lucky so far. Andy had not told Mr. Pratt. Yet. She could destroy him at any time, and they both knew it. If it had been anyone else, Thor would have been rewarded. But Andy was different. She was Mr. Pratt's little sister, and she was off limits. Andy was biding her time. She would use it against him at some point. And all he could do was wait. The waiting was maddening. Sometimes he just wanted to end it all. He could jump through this window and fall forever. No more quotas or whining clients. No more fear of demotion. He would be free. But that was the coward's way out, and Thor was not a coward. He would continue on and deal with Andy when the time came. He had plans for her. He just needed it to be believable. She was still watching him. Her hips swayed side to side, and she licked her lips and grinned. Thor gave the window one last look and put his hand on the doorknob. Andy buzzed him through. Benjamin Pratt was seated behind a glass table. His bright sneakers were crossed at the ankle and propped up on the sparkling surface. He leaned back in his chair with his hands behind his head. He was smiling. Not a good sign. "Thor, my boy." He was up and moving toward him with his hand outstretched. Thor shook his hand, and Mr. Pratt wrapped his arm around Thor's broad shoulders. "How's my best trainer?" He laughed and slapped Thor's behind. He held on for a moment, but Thor knew not to move away. He'd only made that mistake once. "You're getting a little soft, my boy. Have you been skipping leg day?" "No, sir." "Go see Dr. Clyde tomorrow. He'll tighten up your diet. I can't have my best trainer getting flabby. Bad for business, you know." "Yes, sir." His stomach growled, but luckily Mr. Pratt didn't notice. Thor was used to being hungry. He lived in a constant state of deprivation. It kept him lean and ripped. He was the ideal, and it took a lot to maintain it. He'd noticed the weight creeping on, but he'd let himself believe that no one else saw it. He was ashamed that Mr. Pratt had been the one to point it out. Thor was a failure. Mr. Pratt settled back behind the table and motioned for Thor to stand across from him. He never let anyone sit in his presence. It burned more calories to stand. He would only sit in front of certain people, but he was Benjamin Pratt, the founder of the health movement. He could do whatever he wanted. He was a short man, but he made up for it with his loud, booming voice and legs the size of tree trunks. He was not the ideal, not that anyone would dare to say it aloud. Thor was uncomfortable even thinking it. Mr. Pratt was watching him, and Thor couldn't shake the feeling that the man knew what he was thinking. He always knew. "Well, Thor, how's my pet project? Has she made any progress? The boot camp workout was a good idea. Normally I hate it when trainers stray from the plan, but Maggie is a tough case. And anything that will get rid of that gut is worth trying. She does well when I can get her moving. It's not always easy." "You're not going soft on me, are you? I understand she's difficult, but you're Thor, the best of the best. You represent the ideal. If she won't work, make her. She is fairly submissive." Benjamin Pratt smiled and winked. Thor wanted to punch him in his bright white teeth. "Have you tried her yet?" "No, sir." "You're missing out, my boy. She's not much to look at, but if you close your eyes..." He made a loud, whooping sound. "She's a fun one. Not much of a fighter, either." "Yes, sir." Maybe he could choke him. He could wrap his hands around Benjamin Pratt's neck and just squeeze until he stopped fighting. Thor shook his head. What was he thinking? Mr. Pratt had been like a father to him. He took Thor in when his own father died from diabetes and sugar abuse. He taught him how to be healthy. He helped him grow into a muscle-bound monster. He had turned Thor into the ideal, and now people worshipped and feared him. Why was he suddenly so sensitive? It had to be Maggie. He hated training women. Their emotions always got in the way of doing the work, and she was starting to rub off on him. What he needed was a night at the juice bar to get his head straight. Again, Mr. Pratt knew what he was thinking. "How long's it been, my boy?" Thor shifted uncomfortably and didn't answer. Mr. Pratt let out a long, low whistle. "That long, huh? I'm taking you out tonight, my boy. After you've finished whipping that fatty into shape, we'll go down to the juice bar. I've got someone I want you to meet." "Yes, sir." "Back to work. You know she isn't going to work out by herself." Thor avoided looking at Andy on his way to the stairs, but she called after him in a high, sing-song voice. "I'll see you at the juice bar tonight, Thor. Mr. Pratt's got big plans for you." Thor let the heavy door slam behind him. He stood in the stairwell for a while, waiting for his anger to recede and for his heart to stop racing. Mr. Pratt was up to something. He must have sensed Thor's interest in Maggie. The message was clear. He wasn't ready to give her up. Thor didn't understand Mr. Pratt's obsession with the girl. Sure, she made him feel strange sensations when she was nearby, but she wasn't attractive. Even if she lost 100 pounds, she wouldn't be the ideal. Anyone else would have been sent to fat camp a long time ago, but Maggie got chance after chance after chance. Why was she so special? Benjamin Pratt liked a challenge. Everyone knew that. And Maggie was definitely a challenge. But Thor didn't think it was that. There had to be something more. A door opened in the stairwell a few flights below. The sound of ringing metal shook him from his thoughts, and he glanced warily at the security camera above the door. He had been there too long. Mr. Pratt had eyes everywhere, and if he thought for a moment that Thor had stopped believing in the cause, he would be demoted faster than he could blink. It might happen soon. Maybe that's what tonight was all about. Big plans. What did Andy mean? Maggie wasn't in the weight room for her afternoon workout. Thor watched the clock impatiently. 1 minute late. 2 minutes. He knew he needed to call it in, but he was hoping she would show up. He couldn't wait much longer. If she was trying to escape again, he needed to inform the authorities. Mr. Pratt would want to know. 5 minutes. The front door slid open with a whisper, and 2 dietitians entered. They consulted their tablets and zeroed in on Thor. Not good. "Come with us." The woman had a thin, pinched face, and her partner was tall and bald. They wore matching white lab coats and dour expressions. Thor hated the dietitians. They had no place in the program, but Mr. Pratt insisted on it. It didn't matter that they lacked muscle tone and didn't fit the ideal model. They were fiercely loyal to Benjamin Pratt and the cause. He followed them to another building. It was just a few blocks from the SuperGym, but it was one he avoided at all costs. The food labs were depressing places. They were squat, windowless buildings that were scattered throughout the city. No one was allowed inside without special clearance, and it was not a place anyone wanted to be. If you were sent to the food labs, you had messed up. Big time. Maggie's here. Thor didn't need anyone to tell him he was right. What had she done this time? Thor's heart rate leapt as the heavy door slammed shut behind them. He was trapped. Only the dietitians could release him. Would he be allowed to leave? Maybe this was Mr. Pratt's big surprise. Not everyone was allowed to leave the food labs. They moved quickly down a dingy hallway. The lighting was dim, but he could see the cracks in the walls and the mold growing in every corner. The air was heavy with moisture. He was starting to sweat, and it worried him. The dietitians were keen-eyed, and they were watching. Panic gripped him. It welled up inside him and threatened to burst out, but he couldn't let them see it. He tried to breathe deeply and slowly, but it didn't help. His heartbeat pounded in his ears. They stopped in front of a door at the end of the hall. The woman consulted her tablet, nodded to her partner, and walked away. The man pointed a long, thin finger at the door. "In here." "You're not coming with me?" "Why? Are you scared?" The man had a high-pitched nasal voice. Thor wanted to punch him in his pale, sagging face. Nobody dared to mock him. What was happening to him? He puffed out his chest and stood face to face with the stork-like man. The man instantly cowered away from Thor, and the mocking smile vanished from his lips. "Take it easy, I was just joking. I can't go in there. I don't have clearance." Thor shoved him aside and pushed open the heavy door. Maggie was there. She was lying on a table, her face was pale, and her cheeks were hollow. She looked dead. Something moved in his periphery, and Thor realized he was not alone. He carefully composed his face before turning to confront Dr. Clyde. "Hello, Thor. Nice to see you again." "What did she do this time?" Dr. Clyde sighed and adjusted his glasses. "That's the trainer way. No time for pleasantries." He peered at Thor brazenly over the rims of his round glasses. "You never called, Thor." "What did Maggie do?" Dr. Clyde smiled. Thor hated that smile. His fist tightened at his sides. He wanted to pummel his grinning mask into jelly. "Your newest project is mine as well. I am afraid you must learn to share." "Don't look so surprised. Did you really think Mr. Pratt would leave you completely in charge of her case? You're good, but you're not that good. She needs a specialized approach. Tessa and I were working on it before the accident." "Why wasn't I informed?" "You've made it very clear how you feel about the food component of the program. I think Mr. Pratt enjoys your rebellious side. Otherwise, why would he keep you?" "What did she do? Eat a bag of chips?" "Worse, I'm afraid. She's a naughty one. After only one day on Tessa's plan, she tried to escape Famecili. But you know this already. It was lucky Trent found her. That man is a blessing." He shot Thor a look. His eyes glittered behind his lenses. And he doesn't forget to call his friends. We are not friends. Then what are we, Thor? How would you define our relationship? Non-existent. What was her punishment? A power cleanse. They're quite exhausting, as you can see. Mr. Pratt asked me to inform you that she will be staying here tonight. No more training today. You can go home. His grin widened. Rage pounded steadily at Thor's temples. I heard a rumor that Mr. Pratt has planned a special night for you. A shower might be a good idea. He wrinkled his nose and pushed up his glasses. That's it? Why did I have to come here? Couldn't one of your goons deliver the message? What's the fun in that? The truth is, I wanted to see you. I've missed you. He placed a hand on Thor's broad chest. He gently laid his cheek against the hard muscle and sighed. In one swift, sudden motion, Thor broke the slight man's arm. It snapped like a twig, and Thor threw him to the floor. Dr. Clyde screamed. 8 men in black uniforms appeared from the shadows and descended upon Thor. He didn't fight them. He grinned as they removed him from the building. He could still hear the satisfying crack of Dr. Clyde's bones. The goons dragged him to the gates and threw him onto the pavement. A loud buzzer sounded, and the gate crashed closed behind him. Thor got to his feet and wiped the debris from his uniform. There was a tear in his shorts. Blood seeped through the fabric. He put in his earbuds and began the long run back to his home. He was tired. The day was hot, and sweat dripped from his face. The air was hazy and dry, and heat broiled up from the ground. He couldn't remember the last time it had rained. Maggie was in the food labs. This bothered him more than it should. He was losing his edge. He had become personally involved. The same thing that had happened to Tessa. Maybe Maggie really was an impossible client. But why did Mr. Pratt insist on breaking her? Why not give up and send her to fat camp like everyone else? Thor shook his head. He couldn't get involved. Kissing Maggie had been a mistake, and it would not happen again. He would train her. It was the only way he could help her. He would get results when no one else could. He was Thor, after all. The best of the best.